The cold morning wind seemed to carry with it the weight of an irrevocable sentence. She, kneeling before the door she once called home, clutched her belly with the fragility of someone trying to protect not only herself, but the life growing within her. Her simple dress was stained with tears and dust from the floor, but no stain was as painful as the emptiness left by rejection. He, distant, watched with the rigidity of someone who believes they are the master of another's destiny, convinced that his word was enough to erase any bond. The decision had been cruel, to cast her out, pregnant, as if the love he had once sworn had become a mere shadow. The metallic sound of the trash can still echoed as the paper slid out, revealing the image that should have been a source of joy but now became a silent witness to abandonment. The ultrasound, marked with his name, lay among crumpled papers, as if her own unborn life had been discarded, along with inconvenient memories. She sobbed softly, not only from the humiliation, but from the fear of facing the world alone with that secret in her womb. However, fate is relentless in revealing truths. As he approached, perhaps driven by curiosity or the need to confirm his victory, his eyes fell on the forgotten exam on the floor. Those black and white images, simple and fragile, struck him like a direct blow. They weren't just vague lines on a canvas, they were the reflection of a life that bore his blood, his name, his responsibility. The ground that had seemed solid beneath his feet began to crumble silently. And faced with that devastating scene, the question that echoed had no easy answer. How can someone recover what had already begun to be lost before they were even born? If this story has already captured your attention, subscribe to the channel, like it, and share it so that more people can be moved by this journey. As the taxi glided through Seoul's illuminated avenues, Ji-yeon stared out the rain-fogged window. Outside, the streets throbbed with the city's nightlife, but inside the car, the silence felt overwhelming. Her frail body huddled in the back seat, as if the world had shrunk with her. In that moment, there was no memory of the laughter or promises made at the beginning of her story, only the aching void left by a man who, for everyone, was synonymous with success. This man was Lee Jun-seok, a CEO who, from a young age, inherited not only the family fortune, but also the arrogance that came with it. The owner of a conglomerate that dominated technology and luxury real estate, he was revered by shareholders and feared by employees. His impeccable figure with his sharp suit and impenetrable gaze made him the picture of perfection in the business press. However, behind the closed doors of his Gangnam penthouse, he revealed himself to be a man incapable of recognizing human frailty, a man who confused love with possession and respect with obedience. Han Ji-yeon, on the other hand, came from a very different reality. The daughter of merchants from a simple neighborhood in Busan, she grew up surrounded by hard work and humility. She was known for her gentleness with people, for the way she gave herself completely to those she loved. When she met Jun-seok, she naively believed that love would be enough to bridge the gap between their worlds. With patience and loyalty, she shaped her days by his side, ignoring the disdainful looks and prideful words. The contrast between them wasn't just social but emotional as well. He was always cold, calculating, incapable of offering a spontaneous gesture of affection. She was always surrendered, dreaming of the possibility of transforming indifference into tenderness. The pregnancy, which for Ji-yeon was a chance to bring new hope, for Jun-seok seemed merely an inconvenience in the schedule of his perfect life. And it was precisely this difference in worlds, filled with silences and small wounds, that slowly began to crack the walls of their marriage. Each cold gesture compounded another, and each forced smile from Ji-yeon hid a tear he never cared to see. The taxi moved ever further away from the gleaming penthouse, but their story was far from over. What Ji-yeon didn't yet know was that very soon the small signs of indifference would turn into open wounds, capable of exposing the cruel face of the man she called her husband to everyone. In the first months of their marriage, Ji-yeon believed Jun-seok's silence was simply a result of work fatigue. He spent hours poring over reports, contracts, and endless meetings, and she patiently waited for the moment when they could share something simple, like a meal together or a discreet stroll through the streets of Seoul. However, routine soon revealed that this silence wasn't circumstantial, but part of his essence. Every morning, Ji-yeon prepared breakfast the way her mother had taught her in Busan. Freshly cooked rice, light soup, grilled fish, and small, colorful side dishes. She set the table carefully, hoping he would at least look up and notice the effort. But Jun-seok rarely looked away from his phone. Between messages, he responded to emails from directors, while the bowls remained untouched. Ji-yeon smiled shyly, hiding the lump in her throat, as if convincing herself it was all just a phase. Sometimes when she tried to start a conversation, she received only an impatient nod or a curt comment. "We'll talk later, I'm busy." These words, spoken without looking up, cut deeper than any shout. It was as if her presence were invisible within her own home. And yet, Ji-yeon persisted. She cleaned, organized, prepared meals, left little notes of affection on his desk, hoping that at some point her gesture would be noticed. The nights were even lonelier. Jun-seok would arrive late, often after midnight, with the smell of expensive whiskey lingering in his clothes. He would lie in bed without saying a word, as if sharing the same space were merely a formality. Ji-yeon, curled up beside him, held back the urge to cry, afraid her pain would be seen as weakness. Every detail of their routine began to transform into small emotional attacks. The silence that had once seemed like a habit was now an insurmountable wall. Ji-yeon was beginning to realize that it wasn't just indifference, but silent contempt, the kind of contempt that slowly erodes until it erases trust. Still, she continued to try to believe that love could change this man. Her heart clung to a fragile hope, but reality was about to impose itself cruelly, because if indifference already hurt in the silence of intimacy, soon the humiliation would be voiced before everyone, transforming her private pain into a public spectacle. It was a gala night at Gangnam Finance Center, where Seoul's biggest businessmen gathered to celebrate a new multi-million-dollar deal. The spotlights reflected off crystal glasses, and the sound of violins filled the room with elegance. Ji-yeon, wearing a simple dress she had chosen herself, tried to blend in with the atmosphere that had never felt natural to her. She walked beside Jun-seok, who, impeccably dressed in his tailored suit, exuded confidence and power. She remained a few steps back, observing the conversations that revolved around numbers, investments, and corporate strategies. When someone gave her a polite smile, she responded politely, but always with the feeling that she didn't belong. Deep down, she believed that her presence at her husband's side, however discreet, was a form of silent support. But to Jun-seok, her presence felt more like a burden. When one of the curious investors asked her opinion on the company's future, Ji-yeon opened her mouth to respond humbly. Before she could finish, the CEO let out a dry laugh and interrupted, "Don't waste your time. She doesn't understand any of this. She just gets in the way when she tries to get involved." The silence that followed was suffocating. Some guests laughed uncomfortably. Others looked away, embarrassed. Ji-yeon felt her face burn, but she stood up straight, gripping her glass tightly, as if that were enough to keep her from collapsing in front of everyone. Her teary eyes fixed on the floor, and something in her heart broke irreversibly. The evening continued with toasts, speeches and applause, but to Ji-yeon, the sound of voices seemed distant, as if she were trapped in a glass dome. She watched Jun-seok move around the room with calculated charm, as if nothing had happened. She, however, knew she had been reduced to nothing before everyone. In that instant, she realized she was not only the invisible wife of a powerful man, but also the target of the contempt he made no effort to hide. When they returned home, the silence inside the car was as heavy as the one at the party. Ji-yeon held back tears, staring out the window at the illuminated city. She didn't dare ask why he had done it, because the answer was already clear. To Jun-seok, she was a nuisance, someone to be tolerated only as long as it didn't tarnish his image. And so, the first wound exposed in public left invisible but deep scars. What Ji-yeon didn't yet know was that this humiliation would only be the beginning of an increasingly suffocating cycle, where it wouldn't be enough to simply endure in silence. For soon his control would transcend the confines of the house and transform into a prison without bars. After that night at the Gangnam Finance Center, something changed in Ji-yeon's routine. If before she believed she could somehow soften Jun-seok's coldness with tender gestures, now she realized that every attempt was met with even more contempt. The public humiliation seemed to have given him silent permission to treat her not as a wife, but as property. He began to monitor her every move. If Ji-yeon spent more than a few minutes on a call with her mother, he would spring harsh questions. Who was on the other end of the line? What were you talking about so much? The innocence of her answers didn't seem to convince him. Little by little, she found herself having to justify every gesture, every departure, every word. Even when she wanted to visit her sick mother in Busan, she was forced to ask permission. His response was almost always the same. You don't need to leave the house. Everything that matters is already here. The money, which she had previously used freely for small purchases or gifts for her family, was now kept in controlled cards that he strictly monitored. Any expense, no matter how small, was questioned. Ji-yeon learned to deny herself simple things, a snack, a gift for her mother, even new clothes, to avoid endless arguments. The remaining friendships began to fade. Invitations to meet up, messages from university colleagues, everything was forgotten. Little by little, she realized she was increasingly isolated, confined within the luxurious penthouse that had become a gilded prison. The city view, shimmering beyond the glass windows, felt like a cruel provocation. There was a whole world outside, but she no longer had access to it. Even in the rare moments when the house seemed silent, Ji-yeon felt his presence like a constant shadow, always ready to remind her that she had no right to make her own choices. Loneliness stopped being just absence and began to morph into suffocation. She found herself shrinking into herself, increasingly distant from the young woman who had once believed in love and complicity. And as the invisible prison closed around her, Ji-yeon still tried to find the breath to carry on, never imagining that the next blow would not come from a look of contempt or a cruel word, but from a devastating absence. At one of the most critical moments of her life, Ji-yeon's fragility grew more frequent each week. Her dizziness became more frequent, and her body no longer responded with the same energy as before. Even so, she continued trying to maintain her routine, preparing Jun-seok's meals, organizing household chores, and erasing any signs of fatigue. But the truth is, her body was already screaming for attention, even if her voice remained muted within those glass walls. One grey morning, as she descended the stairs of the building for a doctor's appointment, Ji-yeon felt her legs weaken. The air seemed to escape her lungs, and within seconds, the cold floor of the lobby was the only thing supporting her. Distraught staff rushed to her and rushed her to the nearest hospital. When she regained consciousness, she was lying on a white bed, surrounded by machines monitoring her heartbeat and the baby's. The doctor, serious, explained that she needed complete rest, regular care, and emotional support. He looked into her eyes with the gentleness of someone who knew his words carried weight. You need someone by your side. Stress is not only dangerous for you, but for the baby as well. Ji-yeon held the envelope containing the ultrasound she had just received. The black and white image clearly showed the tiny life growing inside her. Her eyes filled with tears, but not of joy. They were tears of loneliness, because in that silent room, there was no one holding her hand. He called Jun-seok several times. Each call went to voicemail. Minutes later, a short message appeared on the screen. I'm in a meeting. Handle it yourself. There wasn't even a question about his health, just the calculated coldness of a man who prioritized reports over the life he himself had helped create. Ji-yeon clutched her phone to her chest and silently realized she was lonelier than ever. In that moment, it wasn't just Jun-seok's physical absence that crushed her, but the confirmation that to him, her existence was nothing more than an annoying detail in his schedule. The following days were spent in forced rest, amidst quick visits from nurses and the constant sound of machines. Ji-yeon stared out the hospital room window at the cloudy Seoul sky, wishing for just a simple gesture, a word of comfort, something that would make her feel still seen as a wife and mother. But all she received was silence. And when she finally returned home, carrying the ultrasound as the only testament to her struggle, she understood that it had not been merely an oversight, but a painful reminder that her presence was worthless to the man who had sworn to protect her. Yet fate had in store for her an even crueler wound, a scene that would forever mark her memory and show her that pain could still reach unimaginable heights. The night when everything fell apart seemed endless. The Seoul sky poured down a relentless rain, as if the weather itself reflected the tragedy unfolding within that luxurious penthouse. Ji-yeon, still weakened by recent fainting spells, held a carefully prepared bowl of soup, believing, against all logic, that perhaps a simple gesture could soften her husband's heart. But when she entered the living room, she found Jun-seok on the phone, laughing at something that had nothing to do with her. The cold look he gave her when he noticed her presence already foreshadowed what was about to happen. I told you I don't need these demonstrations, Ji-yeon, he murmured, his disdain unmistakable. You're making my life a burden. She tried to argue, her voice cracking with the effort of holding back tears, but Jun-seok was relentless. He walked to the door, flung it open, and pointed outside, as if expelling a stranger. Ji-yeon felt her body shudder, but she stood her ground. With slow steps, she walked to the bedroom, hurriedly grabbed a suitcase, and returned to the living room. He offered no help, showed no hesitation. He simply watched, arms crossed, as if her every movement were a relief. As she walked through the door, Ji-yeon carried more than just clothes. She carried the certainty that there was no longer room for her in this world. The rain lashed her face as she descended the due stairs, each step echoing like a sentence of pain. As she stepped out into the street, she tripped. The envelope containing the ultrasound slipped from her bag, scattering across the wet floor. The black and white image, fragile and delicate, clung to the soaked asphalt. The printed name, Lee Jun-seok, still visible despite the water blurring the ink, seemed to scream the truth he refused to accept. Ji-yeon knelt, tears mixing with the rain, and she picked up the paper with trembling hands. There, alone in the storm, she understood that the weight of rejection would be greater than any physical suffering she could bear. A taxi approached slowly, its lights illuminating Ji-yeon's soaked figure. The driver hesitated for a moment, stunned by the sight of a young pregnant woman abandoned to her own devices. She got in silently, powerless to explain. She simply clutched the wet ultrasound to her chest, as if that piece of paper were the last anchor connecting her to the future. Inside, the car, the streets sped by, reflected in the rain-streaked windows. Ji-yeon watched the illuminated buildings contrast with the darkness she was plunged into. In her mind, the scene replayed over and over. The door closing, the suitcase heaving in her hands, the ultrasound falling to the ground. Every detail was an open wound. But fate, merciless, still had more to show her. Because, although she believed she had left behind only bitter memories, that same ultrasound, forgotten and marked by rain, would soon become the key to a revelation capable of tearing Jun-seok from the pedestal where he had lived untouchable. The taxi dropped Ji-yeon off on a narrow street in Incheon, far from the glittering skyscrapers of Gangnam. The driver watched her in the rearview mirror, hesitant to ask if she needed help. But the young woman simply smiled weakly and nodded. The gesture, simple and polite, hid the pain burning inside. She got out carrying her bag and the wet envelope, which now felt more like a burden than a memory, as if each raindrop embedded in the paper were a scar that would not fade. She walked along the damp sidewalks until she found shelter in a modest guest house where the hallway reeked of mildew and the creaking of the wood betrayed each guest's footsteps. The room they offered her was small, with peeling walls and worn furniture, but for her, it was already a fresh start. The only window overlooked dark alleys, where cats fought over trash and lanterns flickered. Intermittently, it was a far cry from the stifling luxury of Jun-seok's penthouse, but it was also a place where, for the first time in a long time, she could breathe without feeling like she was under judgment. In that modest space, silence became his most faithful companion. It wasn't the heavy, controlling silence of the mansion, where every breath seemed monitored. This silence had a different weight. It was a contained scream, a shield against the pain, a way to protect himself from the memories. Ji-yeon no longer called him, didn't text, didn't ask for explanations. Her cell phone, once her bridge of supplication and hope, now remained on the table, switched off like a useless object. Her days were filled with simple tasks. She cooked small portions, always just enough for one meal, folded simple clothes, and stroked her belly, which grew larger each week. Sometimes she would spend long minutes in front of the cracked mirror, observing the changes in her body, trying to find strength in the life blossoming within her. There was no luxury, no comfort, but there was a greater sense that kept her going. Her body still bore the marks of wear and tear, the emotional bruises reflected in the pallor of her face, but her mind was now beginning to shield itself. Each night, as she lay in her narrow bed, she stared at the ceiling with fixed eyes. She didn't cry. The tears, once abundant, had turned into a solid silence, as if each swallowed word created an invisible wall. Between her and the past, friends and family still called, concerned. She rarely answered, limiting herself to short, evasive answers, avoiding questions that might open wounds. "I'm fine. Don't worry. I need time." These repeated phrases were like locked gates, closing off any attempt to access her inner world. The isolation, once forced upon her by his arrogance, now became a choice. Not out of weakness, but because she was tired of fighting for someone who would never lend a hand. Silence gradually became its own language. She no longer needed to scream her pain, nor beg for attention. Every restrained gesture, every distant look, every refusal to share her feelings was a clear message to herself. She no longer needed him to exist. And this silence wasn't just a defense, but also a harbinger. For within it was something greater, something she didn't yet fully understand. There was a latent force, like a dammed river, ready to overflow at the right moment. As Ji-yeon retreated into her silent world, Fate prepared the moment when this emptiness would transform into a powerful weapon against the man who believed himself above all. In the sleepless nights, sitting by the window, she remembered the cold words she'd heard, the contempt in his gaze, and all of this fueled her determination to never again allow herself to be diminished. It was no longer about immediate revenge, but about silent resistance, about patient reconstruction. Like iron in the fire, she was molding herself into something new, stronger, and unbreakable. It was precisely during this period of profound silence that a forgotten detail changed the course of everything. Among the garbage bags piled in the alley, a neighbor found a wet envelope with her name on it, which had been discarded along with crumpled papers. When the object returned to her hands, brought by pure coincidence, she opened it with trembling hands. Inside were documents and images that revealed not only her son's ultrasound, but also personal information, directly linking her to him. In that instant, something ignited inside her. The silence that had protected her became an invisible battlefield. It was no longer just pain or isolation, it was the beginning of a silent preparation, a response that wouldn't require shouting, just the weight of truth, and without Jun Seok knowing, what he thought was thrown away in the trash would be precisely the spark that would rekindle a flame capable of bringing down all his arrogance. Ji-yeon's days in Incheon passed slowly, marked by the distant sound of neighbors who barely noticed her presence. While she sank into silence in Gangnam, Jun Seok continued his life as if nothing had changed. Meetings, contracts, business dinners, the routine remained intact, and pride wouldn't allow him to even consider the possibility of going back. However, fate has a subtle way of tearing the mask off the arrogant. One rainy morning, as the wind scattered papers and leaves across the sidewalks of his apartment building, Jun Seok hurried downstairs to get into his company car. As he passed the condominium's trash can, something caught his eye. A damp piece of paper, stuck to the metal grate, swayed in the wind as if teasing him. He would have ignored it if it weren't for the strange insistence with which the object seemed to stand out amidst the trash. With irritated steps, he approached. He picked up the soaked paper, about to crumple it completely, when the blurry, black and white image made his heart race. It was an ultrasound. At first, the image was barely visible, but his eyes immediately recognized the undeniable detail. In the top corner, still legible despite the rain, was printed the name Lee Jun Seok. For an instant, everything around him lost sound and form. The noise of the city faded, the waiting driver seemed distant, and even the rain ceased to exist. He stood still, staring at the piece of paper as if it were a sentence. The ultrasound was crumpled, stained, forgotten as something worthless, and yet it was indisputable proof of the life Ji-yeon carried within her, a life he had rejected without even trying to understand. The pride that had always sustained him began to waver. For the first time, he felt the weight of absence. He remembered Ji-yeon's silent glances, the way she held her belly tenderly, her attempts to get closer, but never being welcomed. Each memory became a silent accusation, revealing to him how blind he had become to the essential. Jun Seok clutched the ultrasound to his chest, overcome by a discomfort he'd never experienced before: regret. But it wasn't a gentle regret. It was a violent blow that cut through his cold defenses and forced him to see his own cruelty. For the first time, the thought of losing something that couldn't be bought or controlled filled him with fear. He got into the car without saying a word, but his eyes remained fixed on the ultrasound the entire ride. The day's meetings passed in a blur, the voices around him meaningless. The only image that came to mind was Ji-yeon's face, wet from the rain the night he'd kicked her out, and the sodden paper that now trembled in his hands. And it was in this state of torment that a decision began to mature. He could no longer ignore her, could no longer run away. He needed to find her. He needed to look into the eyes of the woman he had abandoned and somehow try to repair the irreparable. The problem was that, when he finally crossed that path, he would not find the same wife who had once bowed to his demands, but a woman transformed by pain, ready to confront him with the coldness that had previously belonged only to him. The night was cold in Incheon, and the silent streets reflected the melancholy that carried within Jun-seok. The black car stopped in front of the small house where Ji-yeon now lived. The contrast was stark. He, accustomed to luxurious penthouses and discreet security guards, found himself standing before a worn wooden door lit only by a dim bulb that flickered in the wind. For a few seconds he hesitated. Pride gripped him by the collar, but the ultrasound image in his hands pushed him forward. She knocked on the door. The sound echoed softly, almost timidly, as if the house itself lacked the strength to respond. When Ji-yeon opened the door, there was no surprise on her face, nor any anger. Her eyes were serene, hard as glass polished by time. There were no tears, no tremors. There was only the firmness of someone who had cried enough to not allow herself to fall anymore. Jun-seok tried to speak, but the words stumbled in his throat. He held out the ultrasound, crumpled and still damp from past rains, as if the piece of paper could be an apology or redemption. Ji-yeon looked at the scan, then back at him, and for a moment the silence became so thick it seemed to fill the air. "You kicked me out," she said finally, her voice low but firm. "And now, what are you looking for?" He tried to approach, his face broken, his eyes teary, but Ji-yeon took a step back. There was no room for easy reconciliation. The wound was too deep to be stitched together with a gesture. "I didn't know," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "You didn't know?" she interrupted with cutting calm. "It was always right in front of your eyes. You just didn't want to see it." Ji-yeon's words cut through him like blades. Jun-seok, who had so often raised his voice to quiet her, now found himself reduced to silence, unable to bear the weight of the indifference he had cultivated. He tried to approach again, but she raised her hand, as if erecting an invisible wall. "Now you feel what I felt every day," he said, turning slowly. "The emptiness." He closed the door gently, without shouting, without tears. Just the certainty of someone who had already closed a story within themselves. Outside, Jun-seok remained standing, staring at the wooden door as if it were a mirror, reflecting all the mistakes that had brought him here. He believed he could regain what he had lost, but he didn't know that the true punishment was yet to come. A punishment that wouldn't come from Ji-yeon's words, but from the relentless silence of her absence. Jun-seok's return to the penthouse in Gangnam-it was the quietest time of his life. The car glided along the illuminated avenues, but none of the city's brightness seemed to reach him. Inside, everything was darkness. He carried the crumpled ultrasound in his jacket pocket as if it were a stone weighing down his heart. As he walked through the glass doors of the apartment, the contrast of wealth against emptiness became unbearable. The spacious, impeccably decorated room seemed larger than ever. The silence echoed off the walls as if mocking him. The dining table, illuminated by a sparkling chandelier, had its place settings as usual, but the seat opposite his remained cold, untouched. It was there that Ji-yeon's absence. He hit him hard. The empty chair was more painful than any words she could have said. Jun-seok walked to the bedroom. In the wardrobe, there were still a few of her clothes, a simple dress, neatly folded, and a scarf she used to wear on cold mornings. He touched the fabric with trembling hands, as if he could, for a moment, feel her warmth again. But what he found was only the echo of a presence that no longer belonged to him. The following days were a succession of ghosts. At breakfast, he remembered the care with which Ji-yeon set the table. At night, when he lay down, he felt the emptiness beside him in bed, where once there had been her breathless silence, so close and now so distant. The apartment, once a symbol of power and status, had become a prison of painful memories. He tried to work, but the meetings no longer made sense. Reports jumbled before his eyes, and the director's words sounded distant. All he could hear was Ji-yeon's voice echoing in his mind. Now you feel what I felt every day, the emptiness. In that solitude, for the first time, Jun-seok realized the magnitude of what he had lost. It wasn't just his wife. It wasn't just his son growing up without him. It was the chance to be human, to be truly loved, to live beyond the walls of arrogance. And what remained now was regret. A regret that grew like a shadow in every corner of the house, reminding him that time does not go backward. Sitting at the table, he stared at the ultrasound once more. Blurry image, nearly erased by the rain, seemed to come to life before his eyes. The baby was invisible to the world, but for him now, it was the most painful memory of all. The tears, previously held back by pride, finally broke through. He cried silently, alone, as he had never done in his entire life. And it was in that belated cry that Jun-seok realized a cruel truth. Certain doors, once closed, never open again. Certain glances, once turned away, never return. And the love he had so scornfully rejected was no longer within his grasp. Regret was overwhelming him, but there was still something in store for the final act. A closure that would not only cement his grief, but also immortalize the dawn was once again falling over Seoul. And from the top of his Gangnam penthouse, Jun-seok sat before the panoramic window, gazing out at the city that had once symbolized power, conquest, and triumph. Those avenues, which had once seemed to him like the golden lines of a chessboard over which he reigned, now shone like open wounds, exposing the loneliness that festered within him. Every distant light seemed to mock his silence. Every movement on the streets reflected a life that continued without him, indifferent to the burden he carried. On the table in front of him, the ultrasound lay, stained by the rain that once soaked it, crumpled by the carelessness of hands that had previously neglected it, but laden with an unbearable weight. He ran his fingers over the paper with the delicacy of someone afraid of tearing away the last shred of humanity that still connected him to that past. He touched the image as if reaching for something intangible, as if it were possible to reclaim on that worn page the bond that no longer existed. The silence was absolute. Not even the clock seemed to keep time. Only the occasional sound of rain against the glass reminded him that the world went on, even though everything inside him was suspended. No phone rang. No staff waited on him. No laughter echoed through the apartment that had once throbbed with gatherings and celebrations. Now all that remained was emptiness, and this emptiness reflected not only Ji-yeon's absence, but also the absence of the very humanity he had abandoned, rung by rung, on the ladder of pride. In that solitude, Jun-seok finally understood that regret isn't just a weight on his chest. It's a prison without keys, built with bricks of choices that can't be undone. It was as if every cruel decision, every word uttered with contempt, was now a stone cemented into the walls of that invisible cell. He remembered the night he'd thrown her out, her lost gaze, her rain-soaked suitcase, her shuffling footsteps on the cold asphalt, and amidst the memory, the ultrasound lying on the floor, ignored by him at the height of his arrogance, now became the image that consumed him. The scenes came back like a dagger slowly turning inside him. Ji-yeon's look wasn't just one of pain, it was one of farewell. And he, blinded by power, didn't realize that in that moment he'd lost more than a wife. He'd lost the chance to be remembered as a father. Outside, the city remained alive. People hurried under colorful umbrellas, couples met in bright cafes, night vendors shouted their offers at street markets. The smell of street food, the illuminated buses passing by, the hubbub of youth, everything went on as if nothing had changed. But inside that apartment, time had stopped. For Jun Seok, there was no more calendar, no more clock, only the eternity of a pain that refused to be silenced. He leaned forward on the table, resting his head in his hands. For the first time, he realized that all the money, all the power, all the contracts signed with applause couldn't fill the void of a simple gesture of love. The absence of a hug, a smile, a voice calling his name with a caressing tone. What he had dismissed as weakness was now the one thing he would give everything he had for. The ultrasound, illuminated by the dim light of the room, became a cruel symbol of all he had lost. It wasn't just a medical exam. It was proof that he had held in his hands the chance to be more human, to be more of a father, to be more of a man, and that, out of pride, he had thrown it away. The crumpled paper was now the mirror of his own soul, scarred, deformed, carrying a story that could never be rewritten. He knew he would live haunted not only by the memory of who Ji-yeon had been by his side, but most importantly by the silence of who she had become away from him. And this silence would be his eternal legacy. There would be no heirs to his empire, no family to carry on his surname, no arms to hold him in old age. All that remained was the coldness of the city and the echo of a loneliness that no fortune could erase. Looking out the window again, Jun Seok realized too late that pride and love never go hand in hand. Pride builds walls. Love builds bridges. He had chosen the walls, and now he was locked inside them, with no one to cross to the other side. When pride speaks louder than the heart, regret becomes eternal. This story is not only a portrait of pain, but a powerful reminder that time cannot be reversed, and that certain choices destroy what no regret can rebuild. It is a silent warning that losing out of pride is not just a defeat, it is a lifelong condemnation. And so, on that rainy dawn, between the city lights and the reflection of a forgotten ultrasound, a powerful man became just another prisoner of himself. If this story touched your heart, like this video, share it with someone who needs to reflect on the value of choices, and subscribe to the channel to see the next chapters. It's his presence that keeps stories like this alive, so we never forget that love should always speak louder than pride.